Everyone, and welcome back to session 3, our Innovation Roundup panel at the 2021 Virtual Conservation Finance Bootcamp. I'm still Lee Welton with the Conservation Finance Network. And on behalf of my colleagues at CFN and our partners at Hallstein and the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, we thank you very much for joining us. Some people may be coming back from yesterday's content. Some people, due to scheduling conflicts, may be joining us for the first time. So similar to yesterday, we invite you to share your name, your affiliation, and your location in the chat box. That'll also help us to kick off some interaction among the cohort, if you will, for today's session. A couple other quick housekeeping notes before I hand it over to our fearless moderator and my colleague Jackson to get things started. This session is being recorded. Recordings of all 4 of our sessions are going to be made available in the not too distant future on the Conservation Finance Network website. So stay tuned, share with colleagues, all that fun. We're going to keep you all on mute with videos off for the presentations, but we very much want to encourage and capture your questions. So please go ahead and add those to the chat box as we go. For today's panel, we'll have panel discussion and also Q&A. So we should have plenty of engagement and chance to get to your questions. Also, as with yesterday, we are asking you to share takeaways or points that are resonating with you, or really anything else that's on your mind on the social media platform of your choosing, and are using the hashtag CFN Bootcamp to be able to track and monitor that interaction. We'll put that in the chat box just now. And then for today's session, the Innovation Roundup, for everyone, I think it's pretty fair to characterize this last year as anything but ordinary. And with that time of change, conservation finance practitioners around the world have really continued to push the boundaries of innovation in really interesting and creative and necessary, if not critically important ways, reaching new heights in partnership and new heights in protection. This panel, the intention of this panel is to showcase several of those case examples across the field, as well as spotlighting critical lessons learned, opportunities ahead, and also really getting into illuminating some of the trends that we're observing across the field and community of practice. So with that, I'm going to hit the pause button on myself and pass things over to Jackson Moller. Thanks, Jackson.
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everybody. As Lee was saying, we have a great lineup this afternoon. What I love about this session, because I've been on a few in prior years, what I love about this session, especially as somebody who's continuing to learn about conservation finance, is that the issues and challenges that are driving these projects that Margaret and Eric and Trevor and Tim are going to talk about, these issues and challenges are going to be very familiar to you. What we're adding on are innovation approaches to well-known conservation challenges. I hope these examples will demonstrate what's possible. They're already happening. There's a role for you and your organization to play in a similar type of project. And so I hope you're listening in today with your knees bent and on the balls of your feet. So without further ado, I'd like to thank our panel for their time this afternoon. Welcome to Bootcamp, Margaret, Trevor, Eric, and Tim. First up, we're going to have Margaret Bowman of Bowman Environmental Consulting. She's going to be discussing the state of municipal water engagement, where we've come from, where we're going from here, where are the opportunities. Next up is Eric Hallstein, who's in a leadership role at TNC at the Nature Conservancy and NatureVest. He's going to be highlighting the Sustainable Water Impact Fund, SWIFT, a partnership with Renewable Resources Group, RRG. And then we have Trevor Cutsinger is the Director of Acquisition for Finite Carbon. He's going to touch on the differences between compliance markets and voluntary markets. And while he's also going to provide insight on trend lines in carbon, he's also going to focus on what's viable right now. And finally, we have Tim Mayle with EPIC, the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And among other things, he's going to be discussing Maryland's Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act. So each speaker will have 10 minutes before we head into Q&A. So again, throw your questions into the chat. We'd like to hit on those. And here we go. I'm going to hand it off to Margaret, who's first up. Thanks, Margaret.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Jackson, for moderating this panel, and also thank you to the whole CFN team, Helen, Hallie, and Lee, for organizing this boot camp. As we talk about innovations in conservation finance, I just want to take a moment to point out the important role that this conservation boot camp has and will be having in the future in advancing conservation finance. Having an informed and engaged community working to use finance tools to advance conservation is really a critical component to advancing solutions. So I just want to say that I am grateful to CFN for building this field and for continuing to hold these excellent boot camps. So thank you. My job on this panel is to be the big picture person. I'm going to identify some broad trends that I'm seeing in conservation finance and then leave some specific examples and additional trend identification to Trevor, Eric, and Tim. So, one of the most important players in conservation finance in the deal is the payor. Who is paying for the conservation outcome? Without a payor, there really isn't a deal. There isn't a transaction, there's never going to be a market. And at the broad level, there's a real encouraging trend of focusing on the payor. And we used to, in conservation finance, really focus a lot on the conservation outcome, how to design it, how to measure it, and the like. And at the end of the effort, really look around and say, okay, who's a payor? And now we're flipping that and really focusing on who is the payer and what do they need? How to make it easier for them to engage in the transaction and engage in the market. And there are encouraging trends in who the payors are in this field and how to address their pain points. And I want to talk about three of them. The first is municipal water utilities. Water utilities engage in conservation finance both through direct programs related to green stormwater to meet their stormwater needs, but also with upstream actors related to agricultural nutrient reduction to meet their water quality needs, and forest management to meet both water quality and quantity needs. We are kind of seeing an increased kind of nuance in understanding what incentivizes water utilities and where their pain points are and how to address those pain points. And that's really encouraging because there are cultural, legal, and legal as well as financial obstacles for utilities paying for conservation outcomes, and we need to address those. Tim is going to talk later about Maryland's Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act, which, among other things, is proposing some fixes to some really non-sexy topics like procurement rules that will make it much easier for municipalities to engage in these types of solutions. Another example is I2 Capital, which is developing a revolving water fund in the Brandywine-Christina watershed in Delaware. As part of that, they've developed a credit quantification system that is really explicitly mapped to the regulatory offset requirements in both Pennsylvania and Delaware. And by mapping those quantifications to those regulatory needs, they're really addressing a pain point for municipalities. Another really important trend in where municipal utilities engage in conservation finance relates to the evolution of environmental impact bonds. EIBs have been an exciting tool for the last 5 or 6 years, something to enable utilities to engage in green stormwater solutions and other innovative solutions for water outcomes. The view of the traditional assumption with the environmental impact bond is that by creating a pay for performance structure where the utility pays less if the green stormwater delivers less and pays more if the green stormwater solution delivers more, would de-risk the innovative green stormwater solution for utilities. For some utilities, that has been great, and we've seen it applied. But for others, what the finance community has seen is actually an innovative financial tool laid over an innovative conservation tool doubled the complexity rather than lessened the complexity. And so there's been an evolution in this, and Quantified Ventures, that's been doing a lot of this, has moved towards responding to the pain points of those utilities. And in the last environmental impact bond in Hampton Roads, Virginia, they took that innovative outcome-based financing away and instead looked at outcome-based quantification and reporting, because they heard from the utility they really didn't need a financing tool. What they wanted was to quantify and report on the outcomes of the green stormwater. And by doing that, that may be able to help environmental impact bonds be used for other water utilities across the country, and equally exciting, may be able to use to address the broader green bond market, which is exploding in the US and internationally, with very little, if no, outcome measurement and reporting. And if we can develop a culture of measuring and reporting outcomes from bonds, we could have the opportunity to influence a really big bond market. The second kind of payor that I wanted to talk about is corporations. And there's been a real explosion in interest recently from the corporate sector for voluntary climate offsets and using conservation solutions like forest carbon and soil carbon to meet their stated climate offset goals. Very big increase in interest here, very exciting. We will talk later about some of the challenges that we're seeing with that in measuring and quantifying those offsets. And there's a real risk here with, you don't want to credit someone with climate mitigation and offsets and allow additional emissions if you're not measuring it well. So that's a real risk, but I'm choosing to look at this as a real glass half full problem. It reflects the evolution of the market, and it reflects a huge increase in potential payors for conservation outcomes. And you can overlay those soil carbon and forest carbon offsets with water quality obligations, as well as Quantified Ventures has with the reharvest tool in the Midwest, and use that to be able to finance conservation outcomes. And then the third payor that I think is seeing some interesting trends lately is federal infrastructure funding. The era of big government is back, if you haven't heard. There is a real recognition now of the important role that the feds must play in addressing the country's infrastructure needs. And there's a recognition of that, the link between that infrastructure and climate change, and the need to rethink what infrastructure is needed to make our communities more climate resilient. Because of that, there's a huge opportunity to use infrastructure funding and financing for conservation outcomes and green nature-based infrastructure. Traditionally, private conservation finance has been viewed as needed to supplement public funding, but I think there's a real evolution now to recognize that in addition to supplementing public funding, that more flexible, innovative private financing can be used to unlock or leverage that public funding. And this is particularly important with the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of all federal climate funding, including infrastructure funding, needs to be spent in underserved communities. How can the private finance community look at where public money is being spent and help unlock that public funding for underserved communities and for nature-based infrastructure? And that can be using revolving loan funds for pre-development costs, as well as for bridge financing for those. I think that's a huge opportunity. I'm seeing a rise in intermediaries to help this unlocking. There's still a big capacity gap, and we need to kind of build the capacity of those intermediaries to help leverage that public funding. But I think if that capacity is developed, there is a fair amount of revolving loan fund, low return investment dollars that could be used there. One example is CK Blue Shift's Blue Bank that is looking to do this in places. My final observation in terms of trends is about conservation markets in themselves. I can see that they're reaching their awkward teen stage. At first, we were really just cheerleading and trying to set up a market. It's like, we can do this, and we were all cheerleaders. We are now looking at these markets as they develop without the rose-colored glasses on, and really identifying where the obstacles are, where the challenges are, and fixing those to really help the market evolve. I think that's a positive view of where the market is developing. And it's positive that we are really working to make the market work in a more effective way. I've already mentioned some kind of examples of it, but there's also been some interesting analysis of this as well. Conservation Finance Network and Gordian Knot Strategies has developed the Enduring Arches framework that looks at this. Forest Trends is working to identify ways to address obstacles to help unlock this federal infrastructure financing. And American Rivers is also doing a series of convenings to look at how we advance scaled collaborative funding for nature-based water solutions. And before I close, Lee had asked me to kind of speak to the question of, where do you start if you want to engage in conservation finance? How do you get started? And at the risk of sounding like a walking advertisement, I would say the first thing you should do is read the Enduring Arches report that you're going to hear about later this afternoon. It really helps you break down what the critical pieces are that you need to develop a conservation finance transaction or market, and gives you some stepping stones, which is also often helpful when you start. And then the second advice I would give you is open your ears. Start with listening. Listen both to the communities that you want to work with to deliver the conservation outcomes, and also the communities that you want to pay for the conservation outputs. Really try to understand their pain points and their incentives, and work with them to design the solution. Don't design it yourself and present it to them, but listen deeply. And with that, you'll be much more likely to develop a really effective tool. So with that, I will stop and hand it back to Jackson.
Thanks, Margaret. So much. Thank you for the arches reference. I really think it's a lot of value in there. There's two. While Eric's getting ready for his turn, there's a couple of comments I wanted to make. One, I really appreciate your perspective on the importance of pairs versus quantification and measurements. That's something that I'm seeing quite a bit just working throughout the country. I guess there's two camps. One is, if only we could measure the outcomes just a little bit better, then the pairs will come. And then I guess another camp would be, if the pairs come, then we can figure this out. I think I fall more into the second camp, but I might ask that question of other panelists just to see where they fall on the spectrum of pairs versus quantification. Another thing that came up to me was this nature-based infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. And I think this is a part of the Maryland's Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act, in part, but that's limited in scope to Maryland. But I feel like there's this, what is the word for it? Expectation that nature-based solutions come in at the same cost or cheaper, while also providing numerous co-benefits. And I'd really like to see an acknowledgement from government agencies that if you want to prioritize these co-benefits, you may have to pay more. You're getting more for those solutions, and that's just, I don't have a question there, but that's just something I wanted to bring up. Eric, are you feeling ready to go?
Yep, ready to go. Curious if we want to pull up some of the slides.
There you go. Ask and you shall receive.
Love it. Thank you. I'm Eric Hallstein. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. I help run a group in the organization named NatureVest, which is an impact investing team that works on kind of bridging a lot of these different areas around finance and conservation to deliver impact and leverage private capital. As I get started, really want to thank the CFN team. I moved from, I'm an economist, but I moved from the investment sector into the Nature Conservancy in 2012. And Peter Stein, who's on this call, Lee, and several others reached out to me and kind of pulled me into the network early on and helped me to find my feet in the conservation finance space, and have just continued to be amazing coaches and mentors and sources of expertise. And I would certainly count Margaret on that, and many of the people I saw who put their names kind of in the chat. The affiliations of this group reminds me that the expertise in this network it's really remarkable. And so hopefully we panelists will offer something of value here, but I think the Q&A and the conversation is gonna get interesting. Let me give a little bit of context for my remarks. If we could go to the next slide, which is the Nature Conservancy. For those of you that may not be familiar with it, we're a large conservation organization. We work in 70 plus countries around the world, and of a little bit under 4,000 staff, about 10% of them are scientists. So very much an evidence kind of science-based organization. And for those of you that have worked with the Conservancy, I think are also probably deeply appreciative that we tend to be very pragmatic and very focused on getting to wins with, in complicated situations, and sometimes with partners and stakeholders who might not all naturally be sitting around a table together in the rest of their professional lives. Next slide. The main reason that the Nature Conservancy is in a sense focused on this area of impact investing and conservation finance, it's for a couple of reasons. And one of them is just the very big picture, which I'm attempting to explain with this picture, which is to say that business as usual for all of us on Earth, for a whole variety of complicated reasons, looks like more or less like the gray line that's on this picture, which is some prolonged deterioration of our environmental circumstances, and I would argue ultimately our well-being. That just increasing our conservation efforts in the ways that we have done really just gets us back to status quo. It doesn't lead to bending the curve, and that what we really need to see is a very significant increase in conservation efforts, and particularly efforts, as I'll explain in a minute, that are tied to work on agriculture and working lands and so much of the planet that's used to produce the food, the fiber, the energy that we all rely on. Next slide. And to put some numbers to this, I'm pulling from a report that a number of co-authors produced and released earlier this year on financing nature. And what it quantified was that on an annual basis by 2030, we're looking at something like a roughly $700 billion financing gap between where we are, even looking quite generously about the amount of funding that's going into conservation and biodiversity protection versus what's actually needed. Next slide. And drilling down a couple layers deeper into that, it's very interesting to see that much of the room or the opportunity for where that capital is needed is in these working landscapes. It's in the croplands, the fisheries, the forests, sort of all of these places that have multiple uses. And while they're very important for biodiversity, and so much of the Earth's biodiversity remains on them, they're also incredibly important from the perspective of giving humans what they need to survive and thrive on this planet. Next slide. As Lee said at the beginning, or Jackson did, one of the things I want to talk about is a partnership that we have with a specialty investment firm named Renewable Resources Group, which is based in Los Angeles, but has a 20-year track record investing in and managing assets around the world. And the Nature Conservancy worked very closely with RRG over a couple of years to put together a roughly $1 billion fund that purchases land and water assets in a number of different countries, including the US, but also Australia, Chile, Peru, and then reoperates those assets in ways that are more sustainable for the environment, are more responsibly run and managed in terms of labor practices and other things, and also deliver a financial return for investors. So in a sense, it's a traditional blind pool fund where the management team has a lot of discretion about where those go. And then within that fund, the Nature Conservancy is I think of it as a technical advisor, providing and bringing to that fund the expertise that we have around how to deliver those kinds of co-benefits that Jackson was describing. There are a couple of people from RRG on this call, Lauren D'Souza, Ryan Gray, I noticed in the scroll. So I'm hoping that they'll chime in on the chat as we go along or in the Q&A, and they may have some observations as well. Next slide, please. This is a cartoon to demonstrate the kinds of investments that the SWIF, as it's called, the Sustainable Water Impact Fund, which is the vehicle I described, is doing. And the notion is to manage these properties in much more responsible ways that continue to deliver production from an agricultural perspective, but a diversity of other benefits. Some of these are co-benefits. They don't come at any particular, in a sense, kind of financial expense. They just have to do with, can we, for example, move water around either on a property or between properties that we might own, we being the fund, in ways that happen at times of year or at, with attributes like the temperature of the water that's beneficial ecologically. Can we, for example, in other ways, store water, and much like one would have, batteries in the electrical grid that allows us to take much better advantage of solar and wind power, which can be intermittent. Can we do things like that with the supply of water, which at least in California and some of these geographies is similarly intermittent and also increasingly variable in the context of climate change. We're getting these big pulse flows coming out of the Sierra Mountains in California, for example, and our heavily built out infrastructure in California is actually not calibrated to the current situation. And so can we, for example, capture that water and actually help create both a better and more resilient agricultural system and deliver these co-benefits like wetlands that might be beneficial for the wildlife that are priorities for the conservation organizations that work in the areas where the fund operates. Next slide, please. This is an example of a project, and on the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about others. I saw there's some folks from Australia on the call, and it looked like some folks from Latin America, and we can talk about projects that we have there. But this is to just really bring to life what I was describing. On the left is a picture of a dairy farm that's near Bakersfield in California. So that's in the Central Valley, one of the most agriculturally intensive areas in the world, and also one of the most productive. It produces about very roughly $50 billion worth of ag revenue each year. And it's just 1% of the US, but produces something like 8% of our fruits and vegetables and other crops. So we purchased a dairy farm and then converted that dairy farm to a combination of groundwater banks with wetland habitat on them. And we're working on restoring some of the rest of that property to upland habitat. And that picture on the right is a pilot project that we did on the property to create a temporary wetland on top of what was a groundwater bank. And it's just visually just so amazing to think about this being done in the context of also delivering financial returns to investors. And in this case, the financial return is generated because we have the ability to bank that groundwater and then make it available to farmers and ranchers in that area who otherwise, and for a whole bunch of reasons we could go into, are water short or water scarce just because of how dry this particular area is and some of the constraints that the California regulations are placing on the ability to use groundwater in that area. So really, neat project. It's large. It's about 7,000 acres. And there were, when we purchased it, about 40,000 head of cattle on that property. So, massive commercial scale. And we're basically kind of rolling back the clock on 100 years of human change, let's just say, on that landscape. Next slide. And this is a map just to bring this into kind of stepping back and sort of showing you a little bit better where it is. On the map is showing where we have overdrafted aquifers in that part of the state, and in that the yellow sort of blocks that are on that left-hand panel are the portions of the property that we purchased. It's in a sense 3 different pieces, and on the right you'll see the proximity of that property to a number of different important national wildlife refuges and other state conservation projects. And so one of the things we've been working on is how can we shift and move pieces of this property into eventually kind of restoration and ownership by those organizations or by those agencies, and dealing with some of the challenges of how to do that on timescales and in ways that, in a sense, kind of prejudice that outcome over some of the other commercial outcomes that are also very possible on that landscape, and what's the right sort of kaleidoscope of land uses that maximize or optimize economic outcomes and also conservation outcomes. And I think Lauren and Ryan can say a little bit more about that. Next slide. And so what I'd like to do here is just sort of end, but a little bit like Margaret, I think kind of teeing up the Q&A at the end, is I hope I provided a little bit of a teaser on that last slide about the ways in which conservation organizations and public agencies can interact in these sorts of what I would almost describe as public-private partnerships. And in particular, in a landscape like this one for the Nature Conservancy, we had been looking at that property I showed you for almost 25 years and tried to buy it on numerous occasions. The problem is that 60, 70, 80% of that property is commercially extremely valuable, remains extremely valuable, and in a sense, it sort of prices out way beyond what we could compete for. But by working with a private partner who, in a sense, could kind of see and take advantage of the value of that commercial part of the property, but then bring the conservation component in terms of the other parts of the landscape that were really valuable from a conservation perspective, we could target the really finite amount of conservation funding in the state and work with some of the irrigation districts and help support a land trust that we started or helped start in the area that could really hone in on the piece of this that was the most valuable. And I think that insight about that there's sort of different organizations look at the landscape and look at these outcomes in different ways and can bring different skills and also different types of financing to these big projects in ways that allow multiple organizations, I think, to bring a lot of value to these projects. And we can talk more about that and kind of what that might mean for any one of your organizations when we get to the Q&A. So with that, Jackson, let me stop and hand it back to you.
Tremendous, Eric. I have numerous questions to ask, and I'm going to hold on to them for the panel. While Trevor's getting teed up, I am going to ask one sort of introductory question, and it applies to Margaret as well, because she's talking about water utilities and government agencies partnering. You guys both provided great examples of partnerships, and I'm really glad that RRG representatives are on the call to fact check you, Eric. But could you provide a little context to how the partnership was formed, the origination story, sort of like what are the enabling conditions that allowed this partnership to form and flourish? Because I have a hunch that the lessons learned here from you and Margaret can be applied at whatever scale the audience, wherever they're sitting today, those lessons can apply. So it may not be $1 billion water impact fund, but it may be a corporate engagement with, Sally's Marina or Land O'Lakes or, anywhere in between in the spectrum of partnerships.
It's a great question. I'll give the 30-second version.
Yeah,
and
great.
Then, and then it's actually a really great story. And yeah, Ryan and Lauren can chime in now or later. But I would say that the Nature Conservancy and Renewable Resources Group had been talking with each other about a variety of possible ways to partner for 5 or 6 years. So really one of the first phone calls that I had when I joined the Nature Conservancy was to one of the co-founders of RRG exploring something in Southern California. Mm-hmm. Then we had another conversation about, well, could we map all of RRG's acquisitions globally with where the Nature Conservancy was interested in biodiversity protection and kind of do a sort of more like a technical report that we'd huck over the fence and hope that RRG did something useful with. And then at some point, that same co-founder and some folks at TNC, sort of sat around and said, look, there's something bigger and more interesting here that would really take both of our organizations in a place that we haven't been able to get to on our own. And then we spent 1.5 years, almost 2 years, kind of working through the legal agreements and kind of how would we put this together, and then launch this. But I would say the epiphany in all of that, the two things I would want to keep in mind for everybody is one is, and curiously, it was our lawyers who reminded me of this. And I think, Jackson, you're a lawyer who is in a similar vein. They were like, there's all the legal documents and then there's trust. And you sort of need both, but you need trust. Just the legal docs are not going to be sufficient. They're necessary, but they are not necessary and sufficient. And so spend a lot of time kind of understanding the partner and our motives and their motives, and making sure that we really trust each other, because frankly, we all understand that we speak a different language. So there's a lot of that, that needs to happen. I think the second, I see Lauren kind of confirming that she agrees with that, unless people are off the mark.
The story checks out, Lauren.
The second is really getting kind of religious, frankly, or getting a lot of discipline about what each partner provides that is unique and differentiated. So to the extent that I think this partnership works, because it's very clear that RRG is an extremely successful specialty investor, brings tons of credibility on the financial side, that allowed us to kind of aspire to the scale of the fund that we eventually raised, and that Nature Conservancy kind of could be very proud of the technical and science expertise and kind of bring those together. Like, I think that was the other part. And I often see partnerships come together where people aren't really clear about what the unique value it is of each partner. And I think figuring that out and making sure there's real value kind of keeps you going through the hard stuff to get to the fun stuff. Sorry, that was more than 30 seconds.
But all super valuable. Margaret, do you want to add anything? Do you think Eric is full of it, or are you in agreement?
I have two very, I'm in terms of this relationship, the unique relationship between RRG and Eric and TNC, I think there's a couple really, really important valuable components. But Eric, I sent you a private message to make sure I could share those. I don't want to overshare, given I was an investor, so I want to make sure I'm not sharing something unfairly.
Go ahead and share. I see your note.
Okay.
That's fine. Thanks for asking.
So there are two things that I think are really, really important from an investor standpoint, since I used to work at Spring Point Partners and we were an investor. They still are an investor in RRG. And as an investor in a blind pool fund like RRG has, and as an investor, if you have an impact lens, they can talk all they want about what their goal of their impact is, but you also have to worry about the first do no harm. And are they going to invest in something you don't like? And one real value of TNC's partnership with RRG is that TNC, it's part of that trust but verify, and you need both. There was a series of red line rules where RRG would not invest in certain property if they had characteristics. And you don't need to go into a lot of the details of what those are, but it was TNC's science-based criteria for, the bottom line, first do no harm standard. So as an investor, that was huge because you don't usually have that in a fund. And then the second, which I think this relationship was the first one in the world, but the RRG staff, in an investment fund, they get paid some basic funding, but then they really make their money on the carry, a share of the profits. Well, RRG gets more profit if they meet criteria that TNC set on each property. And it's the first fund in the world where the fund investors put their money where their mouth is in terms of impact. And that was really thanks to TNC that said, as an investor in this fund, we will share part of our profits as extra carry for the RRG staff if they meet our site-by-site criteria that we develop. Those are, incredibly innovative and exciting tools, and looking at what that partnership can be for other investor conservation group partnerships is really innovative. And so congrats to TNC and RRG in putting that together.
That's the first time I'm learning about that.
Thanks.
That's a very interesting point. But I do want to get back into Trevor. I put him on hold. Trevor, are you ready to jump in?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks to all the participants, CFN team, and my co-presenters. This is an exciting opportunity to get together. I'm Trevor Cutsinger, the Director of Acquisitions at Finite Carbon. In my role at Finite, I really focus on making investments in North American timberlands in partnership with the Lime Timber Company. I think most of you have already had a chance to hear from Peter and David, my illustrious friends at the Lime Timber Company. So it's a good chance to talk about some of our work with Lime. Before I dive into sort of the carbon market story of 2021, or the various stories of 2021, a brief note on Finite. For those of you who aren't familiar with the company, we got our start in 2009 focused on developing forest carbon projects for the California Cap and Trade program. It took 4 years for the first project to actually issue credits in 2013. And since then, we've developed 50 projects for land trusts, tribes, timber investment management organizations, corporations, and family clients. These projects have totaled over 80 million tons credits of issuance in the California program, valued at north of $700 million. That represents about 40% of the total offsets that have been issued in that program. And I'm not telling you that to brag about Finite, although I am proud of what Finite has done. I'm telling you that to give an indication for those who are unaware that it's not just headlines that say voluntary carbon credits are going to be $1 billion or $100 billion. There's real money in these projects, and landowners of all type have benefited from this program in California. But I'm also going to talk about voluntary. So could we go to the next slide, please? Has anybody seen Zoolander? Carbon is hot right now, and there's a lot of exciting things we could talk about. I don't want to, we've got a time limit here, and we've got lots of questions to get to and more presentations to get to, so I'm going to kind of go fairly quickly through sort of a highlight reel, if you will. So the compliance market, which I already mentioned, Finite has really been focused on over the last decade or so. There are some changes afoot in the California program. Fundamentally, the biggest change that impacts all of us developing projects is that up to now, the regulated entities in California were able to use up to 8% of their allowed emissions via offsets. They were allowed to offset up to 8% of their emissions. That's dropping to 4% as the cap also drops. And of that 4%, 2% has to come from projects in or near the state of California that generate so-called direct environmental benefits to the state of California. So what all that means is that the demand for offsets, particularly coming from non-California oriented projects, is dropping. There's not as many offsets available in the marketplace to be transacted. In terms of pricing, these are commodities in California. They're not sort of the story-based credits that I'll get to in a minute with voluntary. They've traded in recent years for anywhere between, say, $11 and $14 per credit. COVID did have a pretty big impact on pricing for, say, 6 to 9 months or so. There has been a rebound to essentially pre-COVID prices, but pricing going forward in the California market with the changes that I just described, it's going to be interesting to see where the credit pricing goes, especially related to the California versus non-California oriented credits. Shifting over to voluntary, which frankly is not my main area of focus, but I've learned a lot over the last couple of years on the voluntary markets, and Finite is deeply engaged as a company in these markets. There are more methodologies and registries than I could possibly hope to get to on this short presentation. Suffice it to say, there are 4 main registries globally that handle a variety of different methodologies to which carbon projects can be registered. My expertise and focus is on forest offsets. Obviously, there's a fair amount of excitement in the ag and soil carbon space. I'm sure the CFN team can point to some resources there. I'm not going to speak really much at all to that space. Within forestry, you can really kind of divide the space into 2 broad categories, and many of you who have been following carbon news will be familiar with this: avoided emissions and basically new sequestration, growth oriented carbon credits. The avoided emissions is really focused in the improved forest management methodologies of the various registries. And RED Plus programs also have a significant avoided emissions component from avoided deforestation and degradation. The reforestation-oriented methodologies really focus on new growth, future growth associated with new sequestration happening on these forested properties. Another big area that's gotten a lot of attention in the last year or two has been small landowner opportunities. I'll just speak briefly to Finite Carbon's effort, which is forthcoming in the next couple of months in terms of going live and enrolling landowners. Our small landowner methodology in partnership with the American Carbon Registry. It's called Core Carbon. It's a digital platform that landowners between 40 acres and 5,000 acres will be able to go on the internet, register their property, check off all the various boxes that need to be checked to confirm that they can enroll in a 40-year project and begin receiving payments fairly quickly. I'm not in the day-to-day on that, so I won't say any more on that right now, but it is a very exciting opportunity coming for landowners who were really previously excluded from the market just based on cost and scale and opportunity. I'm not going to say much about this, but obviously we've all seen lots of corporate and national net zero commitments and GHG accounting stories that have been more and more prominent, and that's all kind of tied directly or indirectly to these carbon markets as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to provide some context on, and this is really the voluntary market. So I've kind of covered what I wanted to cover for the time being on the compliance market in California. And I didn't mention Canada. I apologize to Canadians who are on the call. We're looking at real opportunities in Canada associated with the compliance market, but there's no federal, the federal program is still being developed. And provincial programs are being developed. So in terms of, could you go sell a compliance offset for a federal compliance offset in Canada today? The answer is no, but it may not be very far into the future that you can. So I forgot to mention that, I'm sorry. So back to kind of the voluntary pricing piece, it's really important to understand the relationship between volume and price. And this little table we've had floating around Finite for several years, and it's really just to indicate that relationship where you're seeing news stories and press releases on pricing in, say, the $10 to $15 per credit range on the voluntary side. That's almost always what we would consider a relatively low volume transaction, say sub 10,000 credits. It's not going to be the bulk of an issuance from a 5 or 10 or 15,000 acre property. It's more of a retail transaction. Finite tends to operate in sort of the mid to high level range, in the $6 to $8 per ton, 100,000 to million ton type transaction, and that's where you see that sort of $6 to $8 range. There are now, just in the past 6 to 12 months, a couple of different third-party services that provide databases that track transactions and prices in the voluntary market. And one of them is run by CC Info, California Carbon Info, and the other one I think is IHS Market. And so there's becoming some price transparency that previously hasn't really existed. Most landowners were reliant on the project developers and the large brokers to provide quotes and say, here's what the price is. But there is, I think it's a great development to see some more price transparency and the commoditization of voluntary credits, similar to what we've seen in the California compliance marketplace.
Hey, Trevor,
yeah.
I blew by the 2-minute warning. We got a 1-minute warning.
Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide because I need to give my project example.
All right.
So this is a project that Finite has been working on with lime timber over the last year or so, and I think it's always nice to not just be theoretical and show an actual project. This is a 17,000 acre property in Central Oregon that we purchased through the Lime Conservation Opportunities Fund. And we purchased it because we saw a real opportunity to add value on the carbon side. This property was being marketed and sold by a development firm focused on recreational ranch properties, breaking things up where they can and developing them for various uses. And so the fact that we were able to put a conservation project in play, put in a very expensive carbon inventory for the California program, verified the project with a third party, and are in the process of getting credits issued from the registry, and will ultimately have credits issued by the state of California for the compliance program in probably early 2022. But I think one of the exciting parts of this investment is that we basically took a property that would hit traditionally under recreational hunting management programs that are typical in this region, that cash flow negative. They don't really generate a lot of revenue. The taxes and the maintenance on the properties can be pretty high. The revenue from hunting can be significant, but if it's a private owner who wants to do some of the hunting themselves, they can't really generate revenue that way. The annual credits that can be generated going forward on this property will make this a cash flow positive property for the future owner. And from similar ranches in the vicinity, we've learned that that's a real value add for owners in this region, and I think it's a very exciting prospect. So we will exit this investment in a fairly soon, actually, and so we will only hold the property for about a year. The credits will not be issued, but they're going to be issued, and then the future owner will benefit from future issuances going down the road. I just want to say, if I have 30 more seconds, that for those of you who are interested in pursuing potential for carbon projects and carbon finance, what you really want to be on the lookout for is 3 S's: size, stocking, and story, especially on the voluntary side. So, you can have a successful voluntary project soon with as little as 40 acres with Finite Carbon's core carbon platform. If you've got thousands of acres and you've got relatively good stocking, and when I say that, I mean, there's enough timber there to say I've got at least what my average neighbor has, and you've got a compelling conservation story. Maybe there's a charismatic species, maybe there's a major water quality or water quantity story to tell. Those are really features that should excite you and give you some ammunition, if you will, to go after a carbon project and develop it and ultimately be able to monetize that for either an existing property or potentially as part of your capital stack for a future conservation acquisition that you might be looking for. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Trevor. Super helpful on the 3 S's. I'm going to remember that and use it for sure. Tim, while you're getting teed up, I want to honor your 10 minutes. We definitely have time for the full allotment, and I have like dozens of questions that I'm not going to be able to ask. But we will get to a couple of them. Tim, how are you feeling? Are you ready?
Yep, already.
Very good.
Great. Great to talk to you all today. I am going to try to weave together some of the things that you've just heard and jump into a specific example focused on the policy side. And Margaret emphasized, demand creation, buyers, and that's really what this is a story of. Just briefly, EPIC is a 4-year-old organization, nonprofit. That's our team, and we focus on speed. How do we get to faster progress on conservation and environmental problems? So we don't work for markets because we're free marketeers or for some principled reason. We work on markets and private investment because it is typically a much faster way to get progress to happen. People like Peter Stein are motivated, and Trevor are motivated by getting deals to happen and getting projects to flow. And that's something that too many people in government or in NGOs are just not incentivized to do. It's just the nature of the business. Next slide, please. So, a lot of our work is driven by what is a very functional, very buyer-rich environment, which is the wetland and stream mitigation market in the United States, where there's $4+ billion worth of transactions happening, driven by a strong and mostly consistently implemented and enforced Clean Water Act and various state rules, and very clear rules of engagement in terms of what impacts need to be avoided and how to offset those impacts originally on wetlands and increasingly on streams and other water bodies as well. So I just provide that as context because we often try to look at what has worked in the past and then what can we learn from past examples like that, functional, scaled, markets, and bring them to other places. Next slide, please. And the next slide is sort of what we're currently using as an operational definition of conservation finance that I think brings in more of the governmental role. And Margaret again mentioned the fact that the era of big government is back. And so why does private finance of conservation work matter in a world where deficits and debt don't matter for government taxpayers and the government could just pay for it? And it matters to us because there's still an enormous value that comes from that private funding. There's a period of time during which private funding can play an enormous role, potentially a long period of time. It is incentivized to produce outcomes, or you can build a structure that incentivizes everyone to produce outcomes and to be sort of stringent demanders of strongly validated outcomes. And because there's just often a capital stack, as Trevor was just describing, where you still need public and private finance and maybe multiple sources of each to come together to make really big projects happen, including those projects that Jackson mentioned, where you've got multiple co-benefits, right? The complex world where you're delivering health benefits alongside conservation benefits, alongside climate benefits, and it's really difficult to tie those to specific payers. So I'm going to talk about the world of Maryland and policy and politics in Maryland. It's a state, for those of you outside the United States, just outside of Washington, D.C., really small state, but the sort of biggest part of the state is not the state at all. It's the Chesapeake Bay, a big body of water that's one of America's largest estuaries, and that has a whole lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it that shouldn't be there, which has impacted, fisheries and all sorts of economic values, and is tied up in a sort of a large multi-decade effort to clean it up. Because of the Bay, because of Maryland's proximity to Washington, D.C., because of the location of a lot of creative people who either live there or spend some time on weekends in Maryland, there's a lot of creative energy that's gone into this state, into the Chesapeake Bay in general, and the region around here. So it makes for a really interesting place to work on sort of innovative ideas around how to match public policy with some of the programmatic and initiative-based efforts that Eric and Trevor and Margaret and everybody else has been talking to you about for the last few days, or hours and days. Next slide, please. Like Trevor said, there's some pricing information. So, we were looking at our effort to build policy in Maryland, looked at what has gone before. And some of this is around how much does it cost to deliver outcomes of water quality improvement and how has work happened. And a lot of it has happened through changes in the procurement structures and the contracting structures that government has used for various ways that we don't have time to get into, public-private partnerships, outcome contracts in various forms. And what that data shows is very significant 20 to 75% cost reductions associated with what are often investment-backed efforts to deliver water quality improvements. So that's sort of the first point of reference for us is there are contractual approaches to use if you're a government buyer or a public buyer that can deliver, much better return on investment. The next slide, please. And we looked not just at price, but we looked at the diversity of programs. As I said, Chesapeake Bay, which you can sort of see in blue on that map at the bottom, is a 5 or 6 state, I can never keep track, watershed. And there's all these very creative programs or initiatives that have been started in this region. Some have succeeded, fantastically. Others have never had a single transaction, but it reflects a huge amount of creative energy. And so as part of a multi-partner effort, including local government, state government, for-profit, nonprofit partners, we tried to look at all these programs, talk to people about the programs and figure out what was working, what wasn't working, and other lessons to be learned from that to bring into a policy proposal in Maryland. And now I'm just going to go into some of the. It was a really long legislative proposal that ultimately came together, And so I cannot go through all of it in any way in 10 minutes. But I'm just going to highlight a couple of quick pieces and leave you with a slide that has, a lot more of the details of it, and one that you can keep later on. So next slide, please. This is just really quickly the logos of organizations that supported the bill, as well as a bunch of public agencies. Next slide. And these are the broad categories of things that we had to put together to convince people that this was a worthwhile package to pursue. So there are major components of the bill that focus on environmental justice, that focus on climate progress. Maryland failed to pass significant legislation on climate this year, on green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, resilience infrastructure, coastal area, lots of storm possibilities in the region. And then, as I said, the procurement side, innovative ways to buy and to get a supply of water quality improvements, carbon sequestration, resilience improvements to buyers, often government buyers, and then a piece that's designed to attract restoration capital. So those are the sort of 5 key components of the bill that we can, we could talk through with anyone, any audience, and convince the audience there was something in this package, for them, and that, to Margaret's point about do no harm, that the things in the other 4 wedges of the bill didn't gore their ox, didn't hurt them, either. So again, I'm just going to highlight a couple of pieces that were really critical in this legislation, I think, that are relevant to this audience. Next slide, please. The first is procurement. Is the public process of figuring out how government buys stuff. It's an incredibly underappreciated part of everything that happens in conservation, and it's extremely boring. And usually, people with PhDs in biology or people who like to be outside don't do the work. So there's an enormous communications chasm that exists between the people who really control the levers on, like, how long can you actually have a contract exist, right? Just a simple question of, can it be a 10-year contract or only a 5-year contract or only a 3-year contract, are like incredibly important for, often long period outcome generating projects for conservation. So in the law, we built in a definition of what an environmental outcome means, not in the environment code, but in the procurement code, the code that those people actually look at. And we use the word commodity. Trevor mentioned the word commodity. So in procurement language, commodity means something different than supply, than services. A services contract, you pay as you go, you look at hourly rates. A commodity contract is more like the kind of contract you use to buy a laptop. So that was a key part of it. And then the second piece that we built into the procurement code, or would have built into the procurement code, is a new category of contract. So, there's sort of 10 categories of things that a procurement officer can use in Maryland to buy something, and nothing reflected anything associated with buying outcomes. So we created a new, what would be called a pay for success contract, and authorized that for all environmental agencies in Maryland, as well as Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture. And so any of them could now make use of this new category of contract, which was meant to be a commodity or an outcomes contract. Next slide, please.
Tim, I want to jump into with a 90-second warning here.
Great. Just 2 more slides, or this slide and one more. The next piece is blue and green infrastructure. So creating definitions of what it is that we're trying to buy that have sort of broad appeal. As I mentioned, Chesapeake Bay. So trying to create what I think is the first definition of blue infrastructure in any state law in the country, and then building blue and green infrastructure into the loan and the borrowing and the bonding section of Maryland's code, by saying that green and blue infrastructure are just as financeable as traditional gray infrastructure when it comes to the various sort of borrowing focused programs that are in the state's purview, particularly the state revolving loan funds, which are the biggest lending program for water infrastructure in the state, and in this state and most states. So that blue and green infrastructure piece was really crucial. And part of it is like messaging. It's, saying Maryland is open for business when it comes to blue and green infrastructure. And some of it is actually about the structural pieces of programs. And then the last slide I'll talk about, please. And then on carbon and forests in general, Maryland is a state of extremely small properties. So there aren't a lot of, what was the upper limit, Trevor, 5,000 acre properties in Maryland, a lot of really small things. And so the bill included a number of pieces around aggregation of carbon, state role in partnering with outside organizations to bring in expertise on how to build a voluntary carbon market, and potentially the use of state lands. There's roughly 20,000 acres of state forest lands, which currently don't have any forests on them. And so potentially using reforestation of state lands as the buffer or the insurance to satisfy the demand on a lot of those protocols and standards for a buffer or a reserve. There's a few other pieces on carbon and forests, a few other pieces on like facilitating permitting and getting some impediments out of the way, local state government interface. I'll just leave the last slide up while we talk or have any quick questions. I think you just go to the last slide, which lists a few more components of the bill. But that was the overall goal. And just sort of my last comment is, alas, it did not pass. It passed the Senate unanimously, but the members of the House wanted to geek out on the details of the bill. So they are now doing so with a summer working group, which met for the first time 2 days ago. And I don't foresee, and I don't think any of them foresee any problem with getting the bill passed. It's just that members wanted to like understand this stuff, which is both refreshing and maddening for any of you who worked on legislation. So I'll stop there.
Tim, just a quick follow-up for other folks that are throughout the country. If you could guess, are there other states that are ripe for introducing something similar next session? Just like a short list of where you think this might head next.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mix of having the right people in place and then having the right conditions in place. And I would argue a state like Florida with a large budget surplus and a lot of money that the governor is currently throwing at water quality problems, particularly around the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee and algal-filled runoff that damages tourism on both coasts. That's a big opportunity. Washington State has consent decrees and other clean water compliance obligations around King County and the Puget Sound. And of course, salmon, many endangered and threatened salmon populations. I would see another big opportunity there. And I understand Washington's, expressed a lot of interest in trying to build basically a trading, framework around water. So those are two states that are examples. Once we started talking about this bill, we had about 5 other states that reached out and expressed interest. So It's going to be a different mix of things that are relevant in each state, but I think there's multiple states.
So yeah, this is a question for all the panelists. Of all the strategies we've been talking about in this session, which strategies do you think a land trust could implement within the next 3 years for conservation acquisitions? I don't know who wants to handle that one first. And I can repeat the question.
I'll jump in, things that are useful for land trusts on acquisition. One of the provisions of this bill that did pass, but also more importantly that we got federal EPA to sign off on, was the use of the loan guarantee flexibility of the SRFs to back projects that land trusts, nonprofits, or frankly for-profits want to pursue. So it's great that there's a conservation fund, revolving loan fund, but potentially now the SRF revolving loan fund could also be used in yet another way. Lime Timber has used it as well, but in yet another way as a guarantor to help get access to capital.
Jackson, I build on what I commented on in the section I had, which is particularly in these landscapes that are ultimately kind of have multiple purposes, that seemingly the greater availability of public funding that land trusts can access, coupled with, I think, low cost debt, kind of large transactions actually happening, is to take kind of the very, well-established tools of land trust to identify these biodiversity rich areas, but to bring into some of those conversations with sort of commercial partners who are maybe able to transact on these very large transactions or larger transactions, the piece of the puzzle that's about the conservation element, and to try to put those kinds of deals together with them.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I saw in the chat, we're going to end the recording at 3:15 in a couple of minutes, but I'm willing to hang around for another 15 minutes or so off the record and answer a few more questions. I had a couple, I'm looking in the chat for some questions. Eric, while I have your face on my screen, I feel as like we've got pollination and HSBC, And I feel like every week there's a SPAC being announced. I don't know if you want to talk to us a little bit about where you see things trending and impact investing in that space.
It's a little hard to know or how to separate kind of the signal from the noise on some of these things, and how much of that is aspirational and how much of it is, based on kind of real ability of these teams to execute against strategies that are robust. The difference between, say, what Lime Timber does with decades of experience versus what some of these new folks are doing is it's quite different. I also struggle sometimes to separate between what I'll call light green versus dark green. Like how much of this is being done because ESG is at a minimum having a moment in the sun, but hopefully it is a trend, but it's kind of repositioning existing business models without very much innovation to kind of fill a niche in the market. That said, I think there is a lot of interesting innovation happening. And I think that this trend that I would say is happening around impact investing, where firms are really looking at the ways in which these different kinds of impact, as well as some of the other areas that haven't historically considered around inclusivity and diversity, where those things can be truly fundamental to the economics and performance of projects, whether they're investors thinking about that on a risk-adjusted basis, or they are just project developers who see ways through, say, for example, the ability to look at the diverse outcomes across carbon, water, and other things as a way to sort of de-risk the uncertainty in projects. Like, I think there is truly some very good thinking happening there, and some efforts to bring that to scales, either of products that are at scale or solutions like what Trevor was talking about that allow kind of greater market participation, but the concept itself is kind of, scalable. So I think I'm excited about that. And I think in all of that noise, there is a signal that is meaningful in that regard. And I'd be curious if Peter, you're on, or Trevor or Margaret, others on the panel, what they would think about that.
I think there is, you're very polite using light green versus dark green. Other people would say greenwashing, but there's a pure marketing play going on, but there's also real capital being deployed. And I would argue that land trusts, to echo a couple of things that a variety of people said, Tim said it, you said it, Eric, there's a knowledge source that land trusts have that can help be the sort of glue to attract some of that capital, which is understanding community values, understanding using science to make sure we're doing smart conservation, not random acts of conservation, and being candidly better at explaining co-benefits and multiple benefits than the commercial parties. So I'm as many of you on this know me, I'm an optimistic person by design, but I actually think there's been a pivot in the last couple of years, scale-wise. I would argue that even the term impact investing is going to disappear soon. ESG will be with us for a while, but more evolved investors view ESG criteria as a risk reduction criteria, not just an affirmative obligation to meet environmental, social, or governance outcomes. So that's a long-winded response, but I do think that there will be more money flowing to natural resource investments, sustainable natural resource investments in the broadest definition, as broad as what Tim tried to capture in his conservation finance legislation. And land trusts can play, land trusts and land conservation NGOs that maybe even have a little more of an advocacy focus can help capture.
I ran to get my power cord, so I missed Peter's answer.
It wasn't that good. It was sort of a crappy answer, I think.
It was articulate,
Yeah,
as always. Yeah, so I don't know
Peter's...
if others want to jump in on that. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I just respond. Peter brought up, greenwashing, and I think there's multiple reasons why that or a version of light green exists. But a big part is that our community is not able to generate supply of stuff that people need. So, we also need to figure out how to make, and Peter talked about the sort of sales and communication part of this, but we need to make what we have available easy, transactable, understandable, and available. And we really haven't done a good job of doing that, in particular, because many of us, I'm nonprofit, many of the organizations here are nonprofit. The way we sell to donors is we constantly try to reinvent ourselves and describe what we're doing as new and bold and exciting and unique. And that's the exact opposite. That's a very high cost way to generate product for marketplaces that are looking at price. And so we really need to have two sides of our brains where we're thinking about how to sell to philanthropic investors who always want something shiny, and how to sell to the market that wants, an efficient, replicable, scalable project. And so you really need to be able to think differently as a nonprofit in terms of, meeting that market. And we're, if it isn't just a moment in the sun, if it's an enduring thing, if nonprofits are going to play a big role in this space, and also a lot of the sort of small business entities that exist today, we've got to figure out how to do that, at a much bigger scale and at a lower unit cost. A lot of our unit costs are covered by, the tax subsidy that comes from being a nonprofit and from grants and other things that usually don't appear on the ledger of a lot of the transaction development that exists.
Thanks, Tim. I hadn't heard it said in that way, and that really resonated with me, that tension between charitable and private sector.
Well, the one thing I'd add, and it was the very last item, I think, in Tim's list, but there's an effort that actually Lime Timber is doing in partnership with Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, funded by the Park Service, to look at aggregation models around the country. Because yes, Lime Timber gets to work on large landscapes, and that reduces the friction, and RRG and TNC get to work on large landscapes, but many of you, probably most of you, work in parcelized, fragmented ownership conditions where, a large property may be just a couple of 100 acres. Well, that single couple of 100-acre property is going to fail if it's the only player in an ecosystem service market. So there's an example that I got to participate in northern Vermont called Coal Hollow, Canada, but we'll make sure through the Conservation Finance Network that the research project that will conclude in the middle of the fall of this year is shared. And we're certainly open to anybody on this call who's participating in boot camp this year, who knows about aggregation vehicles or aggregation mechanisms. We're all ears to hear from you.
Peter, I'll just add, I don't work on it myself, so it wasn't top of mind, but we do. Finite is doing aggregation projects, as are other carbon project developers. I don't know the exact criteria, but we can find out and get more information via CFN. But I think it is happening, where it doesn't make sense to go put an inventory in that's very expensive on 2,000 acres. But if you can get, several 200-acre landowners and build a 8,000-acre project, then you can do something and generate revenue that way and reduce the cost per unit.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would, I wanted to kind of echo the whole aggregation piece, which is an obstacle in many places. I used to work in the Colorado Basin and trying to identify land conservation opportunities to address water issues. And the transaction cost for small parcels was a huge obstacle. And that, just to tie that theme together with what Tim was talking about, how do you develop supply? A lot of this gets back to how do we how do we cover the transaction costs on all of this work so that it isn't just, sorry, Peter and Eric, the mega funds that can do this work on the big properties, but especially if we're looking at, the Justice 40 initiative and other efforts to get to equity issues, you're looking at smaller aggregated parcels. I think there was a question about how do you deal with all the land ownership issues with and the capacity issues if you're trying to deal with conservation and more underserved communities. That's all about, greasing the transaction costs. And one value of the Justice 40 initiative at the federal level is there is a big push to have that pre-development cost, that technical assistance financed by the federal government. And I'm seeing from foundations as well as in investors, how do you make sure that that capacity is there to do that? Because if we want supply, there's transaction costs there, and finding ways to fund those transaction costs either through public dollars or through some philanthropic dollars that are priming the pump for this type of work is going to be critically important. Ultimately, and I think it ties into another question I saw in there about pay for performance for small businesses, is you can't fund the upfront costs of your early projects. And once you get going and that pump is primed, you can fund this, but you can't compete up until then. And I've seen that. At Spring Point Partners, we did some project financing at a very low interest rate to help some small businesses do that. But again, it's those infrastructure development expenses that we need to look for public and philanthropic dollars to build that supply.
There's several questions in the chat about just the really like early stages and getting started. So I might pull back the conversation there again of just really what can they do? What can somebody do today, this afternoon, next week, before the end of 2021? What are some steps that folks can take to? I really want people to feel inspired and motivated to join the TNCs of the world in these efforts.
I already answered that question, so the rest of you have
You're off the hook, Margaret.
Well, I'll make a couple comments. I think it just reiterates a couple things that I said. There are opportunities now or very soon in the carbon marketplace for any landowner with more than 40 acres. Or an aspiring landowner with more than 40 acres who wants to think about how carbon could be a cash flow positive event for their ownership. And that's, it's not going to be global tomorrow, but it's coming. And Finite's not alone. I don't tend to mention competitors publicly, but many of you know we're not alone. So there are opportunities. There are opportunities to sell carbon rights, not develop the project yourself. The work that we're doing with Lime, we've contemplated less than fee transactions where we actually separate the carbon rights and attempt to purchase them in the same way that a industrial buyer might purchase a timber deed. So there's all kinds of creative financing mechanisms at all kinds of scales. So, email me, pick up the phone and call if you think you have an interesting project. If it's not something that's a scalable project today, just know that you keep paying attention and you're going to see opportunities soon.
And I just add, this is Tim, that, and I'm thinking about Eric. Eric described water quantity market in California, like the groundwater banking. I know we have some participants here from Australia. Same thing, water quantity as a value. It's a regulated thing. In Europe, we have some attendees from Europe where biodiversity, no net loss biodiversity is a Europe-wide standard with increasing specificity. Of course, in the US, we've got species as well where they're a bankable commodity in imperfect form, but in some form. And then, water quality, which is what I focused on in the Chesapeake Bay, but also across the country. Quality is a multi-billion-dollar buyer market right now for local government and state government. And the question is, can we take the traditional approach of those local and state governments using large contracting firms to build projects the old way and have really green projects, co-benefit projects start infiltrating that mix? But you've got a really strong regulated environment that's likely only going to get stronger in the water quality space, which creates a rich financing pool for a lot of projects. And so recognizing if you have an asset that's in any of those categories, that you could potentially find ways to transact it. And then the other thing I'd say is if you're just getting started in this space, and Trevor basically said this indirectly, but I'm going to say it directly, don't try to become an expert yourself. Find someone to work with, because this is complicated, just like everything else we each do and are specialized in is complicated. And so the worst thing to do is to try to start from scratch and learn it all yourself and figure out how to do, every aspect of the work, you'll be 4 years behind where you could be. Even if you manage to eke out, 10% more like profit or revenue from that process, your lost intellectual capital and opportunity costs will be huge, as opposed to just working with somebody and sharing the revenue.
Thanks, Tim. We blew past our original time to end. We're getting close to our new time to end. But I want to ask one more question, like a quick fire round. In 30 seconds, are you guys optimistic about the future? And where do you think we'll be in 5 years if we do this session in 2026? Go.
I'll go first. Yes, I'm optimistic. I think if you are working in this work, you've got to be an optimist because there are a lot of obstacles. But I think in 5 years, I think we will see much bigger markets because we will have shifted culture and shifted regulatory standards to allow this to happen. And that's both because we're all going to do good work and because with climate change, we won't have a choice. So end with a slightly pessimistic.
I'll take it. Yeah.
I can go next. I think I'm definitely an optimist. I'm not necessarily optimistic that we're going to hit $50 a ton carbon in the next 9 years. I hope we do. I just don't know. There was a question earlier on the chat about oversupply, and there's a lot of supply, and there's going to be more. There's going to be a lot more supply. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Not just on carbon, but on water quality and quantity measurements. I think the technology is just rapidly. I mean, if you looked at imagery and machine learning and LiDAR acquisition 5 years ago, you wouldn't recognize what the world looks like today. And that's just going to continue and allow some of the costs to come down associated with measuring successes and ultimately driving payments to landowners for those successes.
Thanks, Trevor.
Tim? You have next?
Yeah, you're on.
Sure, I'll jump in. Okay. I'm normally like a golden retriever level optimist. And my focus is really on the net. We haven't used net zero, net benefit, net standard, but the idea that like offsets are offsetting something that's still an impact that is still continuing. I think that's going to play a role for a long period of time. I mean, in GHG use, we will eventually eliminate a lot of the use that creates demand for offsets, but I think it will always be a part of the solution. And the same is true for species and anything that involves land use, at least till we get to a declining human footprint in region or country after country, and that's not in our lifetimes. And so it's really a big space of opportunity, and just supporting sort of net outcome standards is what I try to spend as much of my day as I possibly can do. Can possibly spend working on.
Yeah.
I'm really optimistic. What's coming to mind now is kind of building a bit off what Trevor said, is sort of the thinking behind the singularity and the notion of how fast things are actually changing, but that it's very hard for our brains to see that. And the level of disruption that's occurring because of technology, the opportunity to basically internalize the value of these ecosystem services and benefits, whether it's carbon or water quality or water quantity, or imagine the range of things, I think leads to a ton of business model innovation. And I think just skimming through that chat at the beginning of the organizations that are on this call, the level or the amount of intellectual capital that everybody here possesses to have kind of in its local and tailored kind of application, but like pretty unique roles in seeing this happen on the issues or in the places where people are working. Yeah, I'm not usually optimist in many situations, but I'm actually very optimistic that we're at a inflection point in these verticals or industries.
Thanks, Eric. And so thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to the audience for sticking around for an extra 17 minutes here. I am overwhelmed. I feel like I'm drinking from the fire hose by listening to all of you guys, but I could I could do another hour and a half for sure. Lee, do you want to provide a look ahead to tomorrow, or should we just put people out of their misery?
Sure. I didn't realize we'd recruited such a panel of optimistic outlooks, but I think that's a pretty important currency to trade on, given the level of complexity and depression that's often the undercurrent of many of our, community and biophysical resource management challenges. So we'll just rename this the Innovation and Optimism Roundup session and bank that for a rainy day for sure. Thanks to everybody. We're pretty overwhelmed in a positive way that folks stayed on beyond what we had earmarked in your calendars. We will be on tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern for our deep dive into the ARCH framework, best practice in project design and development or project funding and financing. Margaret's giving us some nice snaps there, so we'll make sure to make good on that one. But really just on behalf of CFN, on behalf of our partners at Hallstein and the Center for Business and the Environment, really want to thank the participants for sticking on and keeping so engaged. Great questions, great representation, and also to the panelists for sharing your time, your insight, your expertise. There's just a lot to continue unpacking from this session alone. And I think it's been an incredible breadth of perspectives and experience and models to keep plugging in and exploring further. So that's a wrap for today, folks. And we'll see you back here 2 p.m. Eastern tomorrow for the final session in our series. Thank you again.